Welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is David Little and I'm the founder and the director here at the TCM Group, and today we're going to be focusing on the role that mediation can play in securing and cementing a strong psychological contract. This is proving to be one of our most popular webinars, and whilst it feels in some respects that the psychological contract has gone out of vogue in recent years, actually, over the course of the webinar, I'll be arguing that the psychological contract is absolutely critical in securing a high-performing team, in building employee engagement, and promoting a healthy workforce where people feel strong and resilient to deliver high-quality services to your customers. In many respects, therefore, I think the psychological contract should be very much in vogue, because when it goes wrong, and when the unwritten rules that exist between us break down, the impact can be substantial. It can create conflicts of the highest order and create any number of problems and challenges that exist within teams and within organisations. So for me, the psychological contract is absolutely central to organisations' employment relations and human resources strategies in building an engaged, healthy, resilient workforce. Just a couple of thoughts on housekeeping for the webinar. We're looking for the webinar around 30 to 40 minutes today. You should have a dashboard in front of you. If you have a question, then please do ask a question throughout the session. I will stop and pick up questions as we go along, and then at the end we'll also have an opportunity to ask questions. So please do tap away if there's something that comes to mind, or if there's something that I'm saying that you're not sure about. And like I said, I'll pick those up. The webinar is being recorded and it will be put online on our YouTube channel and also on our website, so you can listen to it after the session. You can also forward it on to anyone else who may also be interested in today's topic. So the focus for today, we'll start off by trying to understand what is meant by the term psychological contract. What does it mean? What does it look like? What's the definition of a psychological contract? We'll look at some of the key characteristics of the psychological contract and try and understand what an effective psychological contract looks like and how to define it in the workplace. We'll think about what happens when the psychological contract breaks down, the implications for managers, for leaders, for HR professionals, and of course for employees. I'll be sharing with you some handy hints and tips today about how human resources professionals and leaders and of course others can forge and sustain a strong psychological contract in the workplace. And hopefully at the end of the session you'll have some tips and tools to be able to take back and support the development of this understanding in your organisations. And finally, we'll also examine the role that mediation can play in restoring the psychological contract when it's broken down, and also how managers and leaders are now using the skills of mediation to handle change, to handle crisis, to handle conflicts effectively, not just to resolve them, but to spot issues early, to prevent them from escalating, and in many respects using some of the difficult and tough situations that exist in organisations to strengthen the psychological contract. So mediation is playing an increasingly important part to play in establishing boundaries, forging contracts, bringing people together, promoting dialogue, establishing collaborative and mutually acceptable outcomes as a result of conflict. So I hope those are what you had in mind and were looking for from today. It's always difficult doing webinars because at this point you look around the room and see hopefully some heads nodding. So I'm assuming that there are a few heads nodding there on the other end of the webinar. Please do feel free to nod heads at this stage. Unfortunately, I can't see it, of course. So what is the psychological contract? Well, of course, there are many definitions of the psychological contract, and when I was exploring this, of course, I was looking at the CIPD, who have produced documents on the psychological contract, as have others. But the one definition that I kept coming back to was Rousseau's definition, where she was explaining that an individual's subjective belief in the reciprocal nature of the relationship between him or herself and that third party, based on the promises made or their implied interactions, is what forges the psychological contract. So already it's interesting in terms of the differentiation between the psychological and the employment contract. We're talking about a subjective belief, and of course that subjective belief can be based on our needs, our views, our perceptions, our attitudes, our behaviours, our mindset at the time. So already we're starting to see that the psychological contract, it's dynamic. It's based on our understanding and our view of the other person. It's also potentially based on our perception of the promises that may or may not have been made throughout the working relationship with another person. And of course those perceptions can impact on the trust that we have in the other person, the confidence we have with them, the way that we communicate and interact with them. So the psychological contract plays an incredibly important part in the building the cement in our relationship, but it's already mired in challenge and difficulty because it's coming from an emotional place forged on subjective analysis and based on our perceptions. It's not possible to write it down. It's intangible. We can't characterize it in a written form necessarily. And as a result of it, we don't necessarily see or understand it. It therefore allows for confusion and challenge to manifest, often very quickly, when it breaks down. But then, because of the subjective nature of it, because it's based on perceptions, because it's an emotional response to our relationship, or it forges an emotional response to our relationship, when it does break down, it becomes very difficult to manage. And when I'm working with leaders and managers as a mediator, they often say to me that at the point where they could experience some conflict, or they're experiencing conflict between themselves and the other person, that they could see that there wasn't a meeting of minds over people's perceptions of their rights or their responsibilities. They weren't sure how to deal with it, often because the manager perceived there were strong feelings and strong emotions, and they didn't feel confident or competent to deal with those strong emotions. So at the very heart of the psychological contract of emotions, yet our managers and leaders often feel ill-equipped for working with strong emotions for various reasons. Now, I've just been talking to a client today about the role of mediation in customer complaints and helping them to think about the role that mediation can play in addressing consumer issues when they're brought to the organisation. And what they were saying to me is, David, we've been encumbered by processes and policies, and it's felt that every time we've had a consumer dispute, we've moved straight to process. We haven't sat down with the customer and seen it as an opportunity to forge an engagement with that customer, to be able to identify what went wrong, to build some empathy and some understanding, to understand the impact of that, and then to begin to put things right. We've moved into process. And I think when we look at organisations' policies and procedures and the way that we handle disputes and conflicts in our organisations, the same could be said to be very true. And so paradoxically, our reliance on policies and procedures in our organisations to address issues or problems when we break down, they actually can undermine the opportunity for managers, leaders and others to come together and have an open and frank conversation to resolve issues. Therefore, the policies and procedures in many cases actually perpetuate the breakdown of the psychological contract and therefore conflict that can arise. So the psychological contract exists. It always exists. It's always there. We may not be aware of it. We may not name it. We may not even have heard of the term before. But in any relationship that we have in the workplace, it already exists. It's always there. It's what brings us together as human beings, as colleagues, as managers, as employees. It's the unwritten rules and the characteristics that exist. It's voluntary. It's not forced upon us. The psychological contract isn't imposed by another person. It's something that we shape and define through our interactions from the minute that we're, well, as soon as we walk into the interview room when we're applying for a particular role, we're starting to forge the psychological contract, those subjective beliefs about what is or isn't to be expected of our relationship. As I've already said, it's not written down. It's a subjective analysis of our relationship and the codes and the boundaries within our relationship. And unlike employment contracts, which tend to be more rights-based, the psychological contract is more about the principles and the values that exist in our relationships. It's more about what's important to us based on our beliefs and principles and values. And of course the strong psychological contract that exists between us as individuals is where those rights and values coexist and are common and collaborative. The conflicts that exist or the breakdown of the psychological contract that can occur is when the values or beliefs clash or are not seen as being common to each other, which gives rise to conflict, as we'll see shortly. It's a negotiation that exists between us. It's a bargain. It's a way of working. And again, if we look at Roger Fisher, William Urey's work, getting to yes, principled negotiation, which as mediators we use deeply in our work, we see that actually the effective negotiation, the strong psychological contract, is forged on the basis of our interests, our needs, our hopes, our fears, our goals, and our objectives. And of course, effective managers and leaders are seeking these questions: what motivates their employees, what's driving them, what beliefs and values do they bring to their teams. They can use that information then to forge a strong psychological contract, to negotiate and create a strong framework and a strong set of boundaries. Where managers and leaders aren't having those conversations about motivations, drive, interests and needs, but perhaps are focusing instead on a set of positions that they might adopt as managers: you do as I say, not as I do, or a more autocratic style of management, or simply where these conversations aren't happening, the negotiation doesn't happen, and those bargains can't be managed. And we tend to find in those organisations higher levels of, well, certainly when conflict occurs, higher levels of stress, anxiety, which can manifest in many forms: increased sickness levels, decreased productivity, tension, gossiping, rumour spreading in organisations. It also makes it very hard for managers to manage in that more autocratic way. They have to constantly be aware of these issues and dealing with them often in a more draconian or punitive way. Having a strong psychological contract between the manager and the employees allows issues to be aired in a less draconian, less stressful, in a less, more constructive way, should I say. It's probably less hard work for managers. So it's a psychological framework. It meets our human needs. It puts the person at the centre of the relationship rather than a set of documentation. And it is individualistic. It's individualistic, but in doing so, it actually builds a strong collective. I've just looked at my screen, Jeff. Jeff's head is nodding. Jeff, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that, obviously in reference to the question I was raising about the objectives earlier. So, Jeff, thank you very much. I've got a picture of your head nodding there. That's great to have that interaction. Thank you. Okay. So those are some of the characteristics of a psychological contract. And what does a strong psychological contract look like? Well, here's a little word cloud that I think, for me, characterises the psychological contract at its best. It's about feeling engaged. It's about having a respectful relationship between myself, my co-workers, and my manager. There's constant lines of communication. It's safe, and that word safety in the top right there is absolutely critical. I often go into organisations and talk about conflict as a normal expression of organisational life. We know that Adam Tuckman tells us there's 4 stages of team development. One of them is conflict. It's called storming. So I say to the organisations and to managers and leaders, where's your safe space? Do you use the word safe space anywhere in your dispute resolution policy, for instance? And people look at me a little bit kind of gone out and say, well, what do you mean safe spaces? Well, where do people go to discuss their issues or their concerns so that they feel safe, so they can have an open and honest debate? And incredibly, organisations don't have the facility for safe space, for safe conversations to happen, for people to go and raise their issues or concerns in a way that they can be heard, they can feel valued, they can feel respected. So again, our organisation's culture, even though our values, and you might look at some of the words here on the screen and say, well, actually, they resonate with my organisation because they resonate with the set of values that we have. So the values of your business may be clear, and they are actually very friendly to the strong psychological contract, but somewhere between your values and your employees, something's breaking down. And again, we can focus not wholly on solely on that, but we can focus on the organisational culture, in particular organisational cultures which are driven by policy and process to resolve these issues. So the strong psychological contract has dispute resolution built into it. It's about fairness, it's about support, it's about building trust between individuals. And for those of you who are mediators, and I know there's a number of mediators on this webinar today, we'll know that the breakdown of trust it's one of the first characteristics of a breakdown in the relationship. And I'm often talking to people about entering into mediation who say something to me, but David, you don't understand, I can't trust them. How can you expect me to mediate with them when I can't trust them? So that breakdown in trust is substantial, and it happens very, very quickly in the breakdown between individuals in the workplace. And when it does break down, it takes a long time to rebuild it. And as you'll see, mediation is a very powerful way of rebuilding that. But again, looking at policies and procedures or organisational culture, where does it exist in our current organisational framework that we can start to rebuild that trust? The word trust doesn't necessarily get mentioned. So I just had another question from Chris. Thank you, Chris. Chris, you've asked us, is the psychological contract between all staff, or is it just between managers and leaders? Well, I think in many respects, the main focus of the psychological contract is the relationship between an employee and their manager or leader. So the main thrust of the conversation that we're having is looking at the contract that exists between those two different stakeholders in organisations. But I would actually go a lot further in saying that it does exist between employees and co-workers, and it actually exists to a high degree between organisations and consumers and customers and other key stakeholders, whether they're suppliers or elsewhere within the organisation. So those unwritten rules and those boundaries that do exist everywhere. Even though we are in a webinar, there is a psychological contract between us. You're listening to what I'm saying, I guess. Well, I hope you're listening to what I'm saying. You have to trust what I'm saying is accurate. You'll form your own view of that. You'll make a subjective analysis of that. And some of the hints and tips you'll hopefully implement based on whether or not you trust what I'm saying. So we're starting to form here today a psychological contract between you, the listener to the webinar, and me, the speaker. So I would suggest that it exists in many different ways and takes many different forms. So that's the main focus. Chris, you've come back in with a supplementary question. So thanks, David. But I was really thinking how you train. Do you use the frame, psychological contract, or simpler language? Well, it sounds a bit jargony, doesn't it, psychological contract? As I said, it's not necessarily a fashionable term at the moment. What we focus on is the boundaries that exist between us. So when we're training managers and leaders, we make it much simpler. We try and take the jargon out of it. So the concepts that we've been talking about already around negotiation, listening, we'll start to focus on some of the other skills that we use in mediation, reframing. We try and give managers the skills to go and have difficult conversations, either to build a strong psychological contract or to restore it when it's going wrong due to change, conflict, or crisis. So the language there is it is simpler, but I think the word psychological contract for me, as you'll see me say in a moment, should be given the same status as the employment contract. You know, we all understand what we mean by the employment contract. That's something which is well understood. I think the psychological contract, in whatever form of words we use to describe it, should be given the same status. So whilst I understand it's jargony, I also think it's important that we do give it some status and some recognition. So what can go wrong and what kind of impact can it have? Well, when it breaks down and people become increasingly insecure, feel unsafe, and we can start to see that job insecurity creeping in. People begin to feel their expectations aren't being met and their needs aren't being achieved, and that can then lead to a misalignment between the individual's expectations of their role and the needs of the organisation. So the way that the job is designed and the functions that people are playing actually can misalign with what their perception is of the organisation's needs. That in itself can create functional conflict between individuals and between individuals and managers. And when people come to me seeking mediation support, that functional conflict, in fact, I'd say, I mean, just from a guess, about 90% of the mediations that TCM has done over the last 12 months have been as a result of this misalignment. This is driven to functional conflict. the only response that the manager was able to raise to that functional conflict was to performance manage the employee. The performance management process has left the employee feeling aggrieved or bullied. They've raised a grievance against the manager, and an HR professional has put a request in to us to mediate in that particular instance. And what we find is the root cause of that conflict isn't because of the employee's performance or indeed the way that the manager has handled it, although they are both antecedents and contributing factors. What we actually find is the psychological contract is broken down, and there's no longer clarity of purpose, function or role, which is causing confusion and causing a breakdown in perceptions of performance or perceptions of management function. It's a massive issue in a great many organisations. The other impact it can have is how people react to change. Organisations are going through some of the most radical changes that we've seen in many years. I mean, change is the only constant for a great number of organisations. And that people's response to change, once the psychological contract breaks down, can actually become more resistant to change and begin, in some cases I've seen, perception is that there's actually sabotaging or blocking changes from happening in the organisation. It can have a dramatic impact on how organisations implement change programs. It can lead to perceptions of unfairness, which very quickly can manifest as team breakdown, cliques, groups forming, gossiping and rumouring. And for any manager in any team trying to manage a team where we have cliques, rumours or gossiping, it can become extremely difficult. And as already indicated, for many managers, they don't feel equipped, confident or competent to deal with these issues. The result of it is when conflict takes a grip, it can break teams apart. It can be that damaging. Communication can break down as a result, and the impact of all of these issues can be conflict within the organisation, or destructive conflict. Again, for those of you who have heard me speak before, there are very clearly two types of conflict that we talked about. The first type, of course, is the destructive conflict, the kind that causes harm, that creates the challenge that I've been describing. The second type of conflict is a more constructive form of conflict, typified by dialogue, discussion, the kind of conflict management we see in mediation, which I'll be coming to very, very shortly. So we've talked now about the impact of the psychological contract breaking down and how it can lead to conflicts. I'd like to spend a moment just thinking about how then conflicts manifest and how destructive conflict can spiral and spiral sometimes out of control before we move into looking at the role that managers and leaders can play in building and securing strong psychological contracts. So as the contract breaks down, my need to feel respected, valued, trusted, supported, taken seriously, treated fairly, whatever my needs might be as an employee or as a manager, I'm not having those needs met. And that gives me a strong and often very profound sense of loss. And that sense of loss can operate on three different levels. The first one is a substantive loss, where I'm losing some entitlement or some right. The second one is a perceived or subjective loss. And the third one is an anticipated future loss. So, and that loss can be a loss of esteem, a loss of confidence, a loss of hope. And again, when I'm talking to people in mediation, it's, you know, the people tell me, well, David, I just can't see the point. What's the point of coming into work? I don't think they even notice me. I certainly don't feel valued. And I think when I hear people say, what's the point? It's one of the saddest things I could ever hear someone say in a workplace. And I'll often say to people when they say that to me, well, look, let's go back to the day you started your job, or before that. Tell me about, you know, the day you were offered the job. Oh yeah, I was excited. It was a great company to work for, brilliant reputation. It's a bit of a promotion. The next day I got a card from my parents congratulating me and wishing me good luck. I was delighted. Everyone was delighted. It was a big step for me. How do we get from there to people saying it's not, what's the point? I can't see the point. And what people are telling me is a loss of a future, a loss of hope, a loss of a sense of security. And as a mediator, I try and understand the root cause of that. And again, the root cause of that breakdown from feeling ecstatic about being able to job to walking into the office feeling what's the point is a breakdown often in the psychological contract between that employee and their manager. Of course, one of the most powerful forms of loss psychologists like Martin Seligman and others tell us, is a loss of control that we begin to experience. And the loss of control causes us to have very deep-rooted emotional psychological responses. It can be a significant cause of trauma and stress. And how often is it said to me again as a mediator, where the parties in a dispute don't feel in control, they don't feel able to bring it to resolution, they don't know where to turn. Mediation and the role of the mediator, it returns control to the parties. So we know that the loss then drives strong emotional and psychological responses. There's an awful lot of literature out there, but putting it very simply, the fight or flight response, we have the hormones that drive that, the adrenaline and cortisol that I'm sure you're familiar with, and that causes us to act and interact and react in a different way than perhaps we were. What's important here to stress is we still make choices about how we act, interact and react. However, in negative conflict, those behaviours and those choices can lead to destructive, destructive behaviours. And as a result of those destructive behaviours, it can then cause needs not to be met in the other party. This is the escalation or the spiral of conflict. Mediation helps to break the spiral of conflict by giving people an opportunity to rethink their behaviours, not in a way where we wag a finger or blame them for the behaviour, but giving them an opportunity to, with the benefit of hindsight. And again, as mediators, we value the benefit of hindsight enormously, because from that benefit of hindsight, the parties can draw insight and understanding about the future for tomorrow. So it allows the parties, my screen is just coming up, so move this window away from the shed. I've just coming up. I just need to get some technical support here. My screen is coming up and showing. It's hopefully you can all see that. It was just coming up as it's paused the screen showing. So the mediator's role, we can break that cycle of conflict and enable people. Is that? I'm just getting some technical support here. I think, is it showing again now? We'll just double check that. Hopefully you can see the screen, but I will carry on anyway. So we'll focus now on a bit more on how to build a psychological contract and the role that mediation can play in securing and building a strong psychological contract in your organisation. I've mentioned already about the relationship between the employment contract. When things go wrong, we often reach for the employment contract. And I think many people would say once we reach for the employment contract, it's actually got very late in the day, and we're starting to talk about ET1s, ET3s, and potential litigation between individuals and employees. And of course, mediation services are provided at that stage, but it often feels like it's too little, too late, and it's about helping the individuals to end the relationship in as constructive a way as possible. Actually, what I'm talking about here is resolving issues before we've even started to talk about employment contract, giving the psychological contract, that relationship building, the same status. So talking about it with staff, putting it into your employee handbook, training managers and HR professionals and others on how to develop a strong psychological contract in the workplace. Creating safe spaces to discuss the contract. And what I mean here is focusing on the role of circle time, one-to-ones, appraisals. It's fascinating. I'll go into organisations and I'll be training managers on how to spot and resolve problems before they escalate. And we'll do something simple like create a circle time environment where one person speaks. There are ground rules that are put in place. It's about being respectful and listening and being open and honest. One person speaks, and you might be familiar with the imagery here. There may be they're holding an object, a pen, or the pipe of peace. That kind of imagery might be coming to mind. But in essence, when people are talking, other people listen. And I'll be offering this as guidance for managers. And I remember one manager said to me, but we're asking people to talk about their feelings here, David. As managers, are we allowed to ask our staff how they feel? So I went, absolutely, of course we're allowed to ask our staff how they feel. Now, interestingly, I've got a 3.5-year-old son. He's at nursery, and they're using these techniques all the time in nursery. And I would suggest that his education, and hopefully this will continue throughout his education, they're actually training young people to be stronger and better managers and leaders. I think sometimes we're taught these things, and our organisations don't allow us to practice them. So encouraging people to go in and have conversations about how they feel. And using a non-adversarial mediated approach for the inevitable blips, blocks and bumps on the road. So things will change. This is the nature of psychological contract. So when it breaks down, not if, but when it breaks down, what will we put in place? Will you rely on a draconian adversarial process where people have to prove they're right or the other person's wrong? Or will you give people a chance to come into a room together and talk with each other? Thanks to those of you who've come on, Chris, Elaine and others, who've come on and just confirmed that you can see the slides. That is very much appreciated. So it was a little bit of an IT glitch. My IT contract was breaking down, shall we say. Hopefully we're back on track. And this isn't just nice to have. It's not just a kind of good thing to have in an organisation when all things are going well. You know, when business is good, we'll have a psychological contract. When business is hard, it's going to be, you know, let's just all crack on with it, and we won't give consideration to these things. It's when the going is tough that these issues are most important. And I would suggest thinking now about the psychological contract will help organisations drive competitive advantage over the long term. It benefits your managers as well. So it's not just a benefit to employees. Managers' time, I mean, is it CIPD's figures are suggesting a third of management time is spent dealing with these problems as they occur in the workplace. The Centre for Dispute Resolution's figures suggest that a third of managers would prefer to jump out of a plane and do a parachute jump for the first time than deal with some of these problems in the workplace. It's taking up a lot of time, and for many organisations that cost can be quantified. So having a strong psychological contract reduces the burden of conflict, reduces stress, injury to feelings, time being spent dealing with these issues. It can help to foster a high-performing culture within the organisation where performance, the need to perform, to be innovative, to be creative, to have dialogue, to have positive conflict actually can be built into the psychological contract. The manager, by forming a psychological contract, can quickly and effectively transform destructive behaviours when and if they occur in the workplace into constructive interactions. So instead of allowing gossiping and rumour spreading or withdrawal or high levels of sickness to become the norm and become acceptable or culturally normal in the team, the manager can bring people together and promote dialogue and often have difficult but very worthwhile conversations. The manager can, by having the dialogue that we've talked about here, can then build a level of engagement to give employees a voice. Now I'm a guru for the Engage for Success program, David McLeod, Engage for Success initiative, and for me the basics of what drive employee engagement. We've talked for a long time about employee voice. Giving employees a voice is absolutely critical to effective employee engagement. If the psychological contract breaks down, many employees and managers don't really feel like speaking. They don't feel like coming into work, let alone having a voice. And it's very basic, rudimentary stuff. But if we give people a voice and allow people to be heard, it's actually going to help them feel engaged and more productive. And how can you create the next widget that's going to make your company the profit it needs and to give it the competitive advantage in the marketplace if you don't feel heard, you don't feel valued? So from a management or organisational perspective, this building the psychological contract enables people to be innovative and creative and to come up with the next multi-million-pound selling product for your organisation. And in doing so, managers can also, if for those of you who are Lean Six Sigma advocates, you'll know that identifying problems in processes and streamlining processes can be a very effective way of building business performance. For me, another way of building business performance is get people who are in a difficult place into a room and they'll tell you what isn't working. And so managers, at a point where the psychological contract is breaking down, by having conversations and discussion with people and allowing people to talk and vent and just giving them that space, can actually gain valuable intelligence about systems and process failings within the organisation, to gain valuable intelligence about the future effectiveness of your business. And finally, and critically of course, and we should never ignore this, is the customer experience. And having a strong psychological contract within the organisation can actually strengthen the customer's experience and the reputation of your organisation to your customers. it's fairly this is the thing about this, of course, it's fairly basic stuff. If people don't feel they're getting on with their manager or their employee, but they can't put their finger, so they're not getting on well with their co-workers or managers, but they can't quite put their finger on it, but they're feeling stressed and anxious and worried and insecure, how do you then deliver excellent performance and customer experience to customers? So there's a direct relationship between what happens in your organisation and what happens outside your organisation. So 3 handy hints, maybe repeating a little bit of it, but I think these are really important just to stress here. So I just want to pick up some of the points that I've raised as well. So naming the psychological contract in your employee handbook and giving it equal status. So I would suggest going back to the employment handbook. Well, my advice would be go to your organisation's values. Whatever those values are, think about how those values then manifest on a day-to-day basis in the relationships that you have within your organisation. So when you're stating your values in your employment handbook, which of course they should be being clearly stated so your employees know what your values are, the next step is how do those values then underpin a strong relationship and strong psychological contract. That's putting the values to work, that's walking the talk, that's making this happen. It allows people, it gives it visibility and credibility in the eyes of your stakeholders. You may go a lot further than that, but as a very minimum, I think having it clearly stated. It brings the values to life. Create safe spaces, as I've said already, for these issues to be vented and resolved, and think about how that happens. Now, a lot of this is driven by your managers and leaders. So some of this is going to be about training managers and leaders to have difficult conversations and to create boundaries and ground rules and guidelines and build a strong psychological contract at each of these 3 interventions, at one-to-ones, during appraisals, and then at team meetings. If we can get those 3 right, the rest will then begin to fall into place. And again, when I'm talking to people in conflict with their managers and leaders, they'll often say to me, "Well, we haven't had a one-to-one for 6 months, or my appraisal's not been done," and that's just indicative of a breakdown in the psychological contract. What this is saying is let's use those environments as a great place to be able to address the psychological contract. In your appraisal form templates or one-to-one templates, a question: do you have any opportunity for the manager to ask the employee how they feel, to engage in what you might call a listening exercise? Is there any space there to talk about the motivations that employees have? What's driving them? What are their objectives and their ambitions? It may exist, but if it doesn't, it's worth thinking about. And then finally, of course, my advice would be to think about the role that mediation and conflict coaching can play in helping to prevent destructive conflicts occurring and to resolve them when they do. Many dispute resolution processes are also called grievance processes or bullying and harassment processes. I'm a strong advocate of building in a resolution process in organisations that in many respects replaces the traditional grievance and bullying and harassment policies and moving from grievance to resolution. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But looking at how you use the word resolution and how you create a framework that promotes resolution rather than creating a framework which promotes, again, these adversarial processes that occur. So for those of you who are mediators, you'll recognise a lot of this. For those of you who are using mediation skills, much of it will be familiar. But I'd like to just recap a couple of points of how mediation can help to address some of the issues and to help build a psychological contract. I'll define mediation in a moment. But for now, I'd just like to talk about how mediation can help. So some of its characteristics. Mediation is a safe process. So mediation allows people to be able to address issues in a way which is non-adversarial, where they're not going to feel attacked. They don't have to be guarded. It breaks down that sense of guardedness. People don't come into it be feeling defensive. And of course, in many processes where people feel defensive, the best form of defense is attack. So we very quickly break that attack and counter-attack approach. It has clear and stated boundaries. It already establishes a contract between the parties. Very simple: courtesy, respect, openness, honesty, confidentiality. 4 of the key guidelines of mediation, actually 4 of the key guidelines of a strong psychological contract. We focus on the interests and needs of the parties. We promote open and honest dialogue, and we enable the parties to be future focused. The mediator reframes negative language he'll never change, David, someone might say to me. It's like, okay, well, that must be really difficult. I understand how frustrating that must be. What is it you need to be done differently tomorrow? So I'll reframe that he doesn't change to what do you need to be done differently tomorrow. She doesn't listen to me, David. How can I work with her when she just doesn't listen to what I have to say? Again, I can empathise with that and I can ask a question. So what I'm hearing you say is you need to be heard. What would you like to say to her so she can really hear what it is that you're saying? And how will she demonstrate to you that she's really listening to you? So we can reframe that negative language. Mediation itself is, as I said, non-adversarial, but it allows people to reach mutually agreed collaborative outcomes based on their needs and interests, not the strength of their positions. I've got quite a lot of questions coming through, so thank you everybody for all of the questions. So I'm just going to take a moment before I begin to draw the session to a conclusion to look through some of the questions. So the first one here that I can see from Jeff King is, do you think that the rebuilding of trust is enhanced or diminished by the fact that assuming a successful outcome of the mediation, the final agreement is not legally binding? I think the fact it's not legally binding is absolutely central to it in terms of building trust between the parties. We wouldn't want mediation agreements to be legally binding because suddenly it feels like there is an imposition by a power or authority figure, and it returns us to our paternalistic state of justice that we rely on in our society. This is about forging adult-to-adult conversations. The question for the parties, Jeff, is this: the mediation agreement that you've reached at some point will break down, and people say to me in conferences, David, great that you get a good outcome in mediations, but how sustainable is it? And I'll say to people, well, our statistics tell us that mediation agreements fail in about 100% of cases. They're always going to fail. There's always going to be a factor that could cause conflict in the future. So the effective mediator equips the parties for dealing with those challenges when they come along in the future. We ask people to act like adults and to treat each other like adults. And there's a recognition that problems will occur. So what have you learned from today's conflict that will help you resolve tomorrow's conflict? We don't need a judge or another party to do us and to make it legally binding. That in many respects diminishes the value, Jeff, I think, of the power of mediation. Another question, Judith, thank you very much for this question. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by giving the psychological contract the same status as the employment contract, and in what way? Well, the employment contract, it exists in a written form. It's one of the first pieces of documentation that we receive from the organisation. Once we've been given a job offer, we'll receive that, we'll sign it, and that sets out the terms and conditions of our employment, in essence our entitlement and what's expected of us. It'll often include a copy of the job description. So it's clearly codified, it's clearly set out, it's often very well written, well structured, and of course it can be tested in a court. The psychological contract doesn't even get named. It doesn't get mentioned. So what I mean by giving it the same status, I mean in some respects it will never receive the same status in law as the employment contract, but at least naming it and recognising that there are two contracts at play within the organisation, that there is a set of unwritten rules that exist based on the values, the beliefs, the things that we've been talking about, the systems and processes that we've been talking about, that are as important in our relationships as the employment contract. So when I talk about the status, what I talk about maybe is about visibility of language and visibility that these two different elements exist and coexist in the workplace. I'm not talking about same status in the eyes of the legal process, but I'm talking about it in terms of visibility within the organisation. So I hope that's helpful, Judith. Thanks, Marion, for your comments. And the really important point that you sent here is the really important point is the recognition that when people's needs are not met, their behaviour changes and becomes destructive, in that they can cause other people's needs and the organisation's needs to become unmet. And I think what you're saying there, Marion, is reinforcing that conflicts can spiral very quickly because our needs aren't being met. And again, just to reinforce, the mediator's role can be to promote dialogue and break that destructive cycle. So thank you for that. I'll come to a couple of the other questions, Jeff and Elaine, just towards the end of the session. So there's a couple of final points I'd raise, but these are fantastic questions, really, really good questions. Thank you so much. And I'm also really happy to answer any questions after after today's webinar. It's clearly a very interesting and very stimulating topic, and I'm thoroughly enjoying talking about it, if I could say that. So the definition is, I think we've covered a lot of these already. It's a safe, non-adversarial process of dispute resolution. It's really important to say this as well. It's not about, it has a beginning, a middle, and end. Some people think it's a bit pink and fluffy and cuddly and a little bit wishy-washy. It's not. Mediation is a very clear process and framework which underpins it. It's about bringing an issue to a resolution. It's not about a chat that may or may not work. So mediation helps people find and identify solutions which are mutually acceptable. The impartial third party, by the way, the impartial third party can be a manager, an HR professional, someone from within the organisation, or an internal mediator or an external mediator. And we train a whole array of different people to act in a non-partisan, objective way at times of conflict. But the best mediators you have right now are your managers. And we spend a lot of our time upskilling managers and supporting them to be conflict competent managers, to be able to bring issues to a resolution quickly and spot problems and prevent them from escalating when they see them in their organisations. The outcome of mediation is mutually acceptable and collaborative, and of course as mediators we don't tell the parties what to do, we don't make judgments about who's right or wrong, and we don't assess culpability or blame. The mediation process is voluntary and it's a confidential process. There's no record of mediation kept, and I think the confidentiality of mediation is absolutely central to one of the most important characteristics I've already mentioned. People say to me, David, what is the essence of mediation? And the essence of mediation and how it can impact on the psychological contract, for me, is about openness and honesty. When we feel, as we often do, that our rights have been breached or that we have been given the things that we're entitled to, we take a view that we're right and the other person is wrong. The other person feels guarded, and they're careful and guarded in what they say. They're not necessarily open and honest, and that drives a lack of openness and honesty. And I often hear conversations in mediation at the early stages where you can see people holding back. The most powerful outcomes that are achieved are where people, for a moment, feel confident and able to have an open and honest conversation. And one of my final reflections, really, is to think about how organisations, policies, again, I don't want to keep blaming policies and procedures. It's not everything, but I do see some policies and procedures that do make my eyes water in terms of the potential impact they have on this. And many policies and procedures, again, paradoxically, prevent people being open and honest. And I see it. I'm a workplace investigator as well. I see it when I'm doing investigations, and I have a team of investigators here, just how difficult it is to identify the root cause of a problem, often because people feel defensive and guarded. It just doesn't happen in mediation because people know they can have these safe conversations. So some next steps from us. We're obviously working in the space. We're very active in developing mediation services and conflict coaching tools for organisations, and we work actively to help organisations develop dispute resolution policies and practices, training employees, managers and others in how to resolve disputes and best practice in mediation. We develop dignity at work, fair treatment programs, design internal mediation schemes. We train managers, unions and others to use mediation to secure lasting outcomes. And we do an awful lot around the whole conflict change and crisis management activity. So I had a few more questions. So sorry we've gone slightly over the time that we initially allocated, but the amount of questions here are absolutely fabulous, so thank you very much. So I think, Jeff, I'll come to yours next. So do you agree that it's often the opportunity to be heard that is the most beneficial outcome of a mediation, and therefore is something that can be addressed before matters escalate? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a great question. Again, Jeff, thank you. I'll be doing a mediation, and it's gone very well, and at the end of the process you're talking to the parties a little bit about their reflections on the process, and they'll say to me often, and it's no coincidence because it's said to me an awful lot, is, well, one of the things, David, you did differently is you listened to me, you allowed me to speak. And I'll say, but then the conflict's been going on for 6 years, I can't be the first person that sat down and listened to you. And you say, David, you might not believe this, but you are. And I think that's really sad. So when you look at the organisations, policies, procedures, the structure, the systems and processes, the training given to managers, those opportunities don't exist, or when they do, they're missed for whatever reason. And I think, Jeff, you're absolutely right. It's give people a voice. Give them a chance to be heard. Don't judge or blame them. Just let them say what's on their mind. And people, it's cathartic, and that catharsis is so important. What it also does is it allows people, by saying it, to excrete those hormones, the cortisol and adrenaline. If you can't get it out of your system, you know the term "you can't get it out of your system" it's a great term, because as you're not getting it out of your system, you're building up these negative hormones, particularly the cortisol, the stressor hormone. So not only you've got all of these behaviours which are compounding on themselves, internally your physiology is building up these stressors, and it becomes harder and harder for you to manage. You're not sleeping well at night. You know, you're constantly thinking about these problems in the workplace. It just becomes much harder to deal with. So the old motto, Jeff, 2 ears and 1 mouth, I think is key. Elaine, you talked about, first of all, thank you for this question, you talked about organisational culture. How can managers demonstrate their actions support a positive culture and working within a workplace community? Again, it's a great question, and for me this is a really important role that HR can play within the organisation. If you look at Dave Ulrich's model of HR, if you look at the HR profession map from CIPD, if you look at effective HR practice, it's about supporting employee engagement, employee relations. A lot of work is being done to devolve HR functions down the line and support managers to create strong, healthy, resilient workforce. The problem for many organisations, I know it's not across the board, it's not all organisations, is the HR function is undermined because they become the police officers of the organisation who are the custodians of a policy or procedure or framework which is in itself inherently adversarial. So the HR function is in a state of conflict in my mind. HR professionals want to take on the role of employee advocates, employee engagement, employee relations, but undermined because of the policies and processes that they have to play. So for me, the best people to support developing this organisational culture is the HR professional. But for me, when I'm working with HR professionals in organisations, there needs to be a very clear and coherent debate about the function of HR and the negative impact that many of the HR policies and procedures have, and how they in themselves can create an inherently, unwittingly so by the way, but can create an inherently adversarial system of dispute resolution. So the HR professional is key, but there has to be a debate for me about the role of HR in promoting these issues. There are other aspects in terms of governance, and clearly linking it to the organisational values also brings the psychological contract in front of bringing it to board level attention. There's a question here, Chris, thank you very much. What are the roles of internal versus external mediation in handling breakdowns in the psychological contract? Chris, you've identified a whole new webinar topic for me there, so I'm not going to try and answer that question here, and we will, and I have explored in previous sessions, and I will run another webinar on the benefits of and also the limitations of internal versus external mediators. So Chris, if you can hold with me on that till the new year, I will put another webinar out. Suffice to say, there are benefits and limitations in both models, but that's a mediator's answer, I'm afraid. I will come back to you with more detail on that. And Jeff, thank you. I just read your question, which is a very nice bit of feedback, so I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So in conclusion, for today, so the psychological contract for me, even though it doesn't feel like it's in vogue at the moment, feels that it's now more important than it's ever been. Very few people seem to talk about it apart from us, of course, and others. I think HR and managers really should be secure and confident in securing the deal, securing that strong psychological contract. Mediation can help. It can help resolve things when they go wrong. It actually can prevent them from going wrong in the first place. So I hope that I've been able to share some of my insights and thoughts around that with you. So thank you very much for listening today. Thank you very much for joining the webinar, and really appreciate all the questions. Absolutely fabulous. Really enjoyed that. So we'll get a transcript of this typed up. We'll also put it online. I'm sure other people will be interested in hearing this webinar, and please do feel free to share the link with anyone who you think might be interested. And of course, if you're interested in meeting me in person, I run workshops and sessions and seminars, and I'm always happy to come out and meet with you over coffee or talk to yourself and some of your colleagues. So I'm off to the Personnel Today Awards this evening. we're sponsoring the award for Innovation and Dispute Resolution, so looking forward to hearing who the lucky winner is of that award. So I best get myself organised. I've got my tux hanging up here in the office. So that's how I'm spending my evening. I hope you have a great rest of the day and a lovely evening yourself. So thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll welcome you on to our next webinar. Bye-bye.